Hi, good evening. We'll get started in just a second as we let people come in. Hi there, welcome. We'll get started in just a second. Thanks for joining us. If you're here to listen to the talk about a wolf at the schoolhouse door, you're in the right place. We'll get started in just a second as we wait for more people to join. All right, as people are still joining, I'm just gonna go ahead and start, and we'll just keep letting people in and just go from there. Good evening, everyone. My name is Courtney, and on behalf of Changing Hands and our wonderful partners at Save Our Schools, thank you for joining us for today's online book talk. We appreciate your continuing support during these times of social distance. We may not be able to host audiences in our stores, but we're still hard at work booking authors for online events just like this one. Please check out our calendar at changinghands.com for more details. Some of you may have purchased a book with your ticket. If you've chosen store pickup, your copies are ready in both Tempe and Phoenix. If you've opted for a mail out, unfortunately, last week's inclement weather delayed our stock shipment, so we are still waiting for books to arrive. Once they come in, we will get them mailed out to you right away. Just a few things to remember during this live stream event. The event will run from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock. When you first join, your audio and video will be disabled. You can see us, but we can't see you. You are more than welcome to ask our authors questions. We'll have a Q&A session towards the end of the program. So as you think of questions during the program, you can put them in the chat and our moderator will pull them from there. If at any time you're having trouble hearing or seeing us, feel free to use the chat to communicate privately with me, and I will do my very best to help troubleshoot the problem. Now let's get started. I am so excited to welcome Jennifer Berkshire, Jack Schneider, and Sharon Kirsch, our lovely moderator from Save Our Schools. A journalist and public education advocate, Jennifer Berkshire's articles have appeared in The Nation, The New Republic, The New York Times, and numerous other publications. She also teaches in the journalism program at Boston College and the labor studies program at UMass Amherst. Jack Schneider calls himself a scholar of education history and policy, and as an assistant professor of education at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, a co-founder of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment, and the co-editor of History of Education Quarterly, we're inclined to agree. Together, Jack and Jennifer co-host the podcast, Have You Heard?, where they examine education policy and politics, one hot button topic at a time. Sharon Kirsch is a co-founder of Save Our Schools Arizona, a nonpartisan grassroots organization fighting for strong public schools. With more than 25 years of teaching in public universities, including ASU, where she is currently an associate professor of English, Sharon believes that the people of Arizona, not out-of-state special interests, should make decisions about public education in our state. Due to a scheduling conflict, Jack will be joining us a little later on in the presentation, but for right now, I'm going to turn things over to Sharon and Jennifer.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, and a really, really big thank you to Changing Hands Bookstore. They are a wonderful, wonderful business in both Phoenix and Tempe, and they have always supported us and always supported public education and their communities in such wonderful ways. So we really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. And Jennifer, I'm excited to have a chance to talk with you again.
I'm excited to be here. And frankly, I'm kind of glad that we get some special time alone, Sharon, because Jack and I have been doing a lot of events together. And I often feel like that episode of the Brady Bunch where Jan is so jealous of Marcia. So Jack, as you will learn when he joins us midway through, is also really an expert on standardized tests and all the problems with them. He wrote another book called A Better Measure. And so wherever we go, people also want to talk about that. And so I often spend time in my little Zoom box, wondering, well, when's it going to be my turn? Jack, Jack, Jack.
Well, it is your turn now. So, and I also want to welcome everybody to National Public Schools Week. So this is a great week where we are celebrating our public schools. And in the past, in the non-pandemic past, we have invited lawmakers to visit schools across Arizona. Of course, we can't do that quite in the same way now, but we can do lots of things to celebrate our public schools, thank our teachers, give our kids an extra hug because they're working so hard, often mediated through the little boxes on Zoom. So take a moment at some point this week and thank a teacher, thank an administrator or a principal for all that they're doing to deal with, especially what they're dealing with during the pandemic. So, well, okay, Jennifer, we could talk about Jack, but let's talk about Arizona and
talk about Arizona
book, Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door. I know a lot of people who are joining us tonight have read it, and a lot of other people still want to read it. But let's talk a little bit. Why don't you tell us just a little bit about the book, and then if Arizona is included in it?
Well, not only is Arizona included, but Arizona features very prominently in the book. I first learned about what was happening in Arizona because I attended a presentation at a Network for Public Education conference attended by Sharon and Dawn, and learned about the stuff that was going on, the efforts to expand vouchers, and how this scrappy group of parents was really having pretty amazing success at organizing. And the more I learned about Arizona, the more it helped me understand where the push for vouchers really came from, how old this dream is, how for decade after decade, how it has sort of survived. And then given any opportunity, as in the pandemic right now, you see these, this sort of dramatic push to expand vouchers. So we used Arizona as kind of like a cautionary tale for other states where either legislation like this doesn't yet exist or it's in the very, very early stages. And we painted a picture of Arizona as frankly kind of a Wild West, right? Where legislators by design had expanded a program again and again, had kind of, kept it out of the harsh glare of accountability by design. And, just to let people know, like, these are the kinds of problems that they're running into in Arizona. But when we wrote our book, we mentioned Arizona as kind of a success story, thinking about the success of Save Our Schools Arizona in stopping this kind of legislative power grab in its tracks. So lo and behold, here we are today. And I don't think that we would have imagined the kind of legislative shenanigans that are happening right now. And Sharon, since you happen to be an expert in all of this, and I feel like I missed one day in Arizona, so yeah. I'm not up on the latest. I wondered if you could just fill people in on what is happening at your state house.
Sure. And I'll start by saying I'm one of those scrappy moms who, I've got kids who go to school here and have been educated all their lives. My daughter's in college now. And before I got involved with Save Our Schools, I had a sense that the public schools in Arizona were struggling, that things were really tough. I had no faint clue how bad the crisis is facing our public schools. And I certainly had no faint clue why it was so bad. And when we referred that voucher bill, and it would have, so Arizona has empowerment scholarship account vouchers. It takes our public tax dollars, puts it on a debit card or puts it in an account, gives it to a parent, and the parent decides how to use that money for their child's education. And in Arizona, families get between $6,000 and $42,000 per child per year. So that program would have expanded universally. And that was around the time Save Our Schools was just beginning to form. But I remember not really understanding this and thinking, why would they pass a bill to expand this program 400% when I have to buy a copy paper for my teacher and markers for my kid? Like, our schools don't have basic supplies, or my daughter had 4 different chemistry teachers because our schools struggle so desperately to keep teachers. So when Prop 305 was on the ballot 2 years ago, as is always the case that vouchers have gone to the ballot in any state in the United States, citizens say, no, we don't want to expand vouchers. We want our public schools to be strong. So Prop 305 passed in November of 2018. The legislative session in 2019, they tried to pass 5 additional voucher expansion bills. And we, along with many other people, shot all those down. So yet last year was crazy because of the pandemic. This year, they are yet again trying to expand vouchers, both kinds of vouchers that we have in Arizona, the ESA, the Empowerment Scholarship Account, and then also the tax credit voucher, the STO vouchers, they're called here. And those are tax credits that are turned into scholarships and given to kids. And 93% of all the recipients of the over $200 million of STO vouchers, 93% of that money goes to religious schools. So what we're facing this year, again, even though the people in Arizona keep saying, public education, we want you to prioritize our public schools. There is a bill, Senate Bill 1452, which would expand ESA vouchers again, almost universally. So they claim it's for low-income kids, which is often the way these things work. But the way the bill is written, it's for schools it's for people who attend a Title I school. Title I schools have 40% of free and reduced lunch kids. So 60% of the kids are not free and reduced lunch kids. And so this would expand again, after years and years and years of expanding, it would expand the voucher program to almost 700,000 kids in Arizona. We have 1.1 million kids. So, and then we have a couple of other bills that would expand the STO vouchers, and the governor is twisting arms. So the group there are many groups behind this, but in Arizona, this particular package of bills that Senator Paul Boyer is sponsoring, he is working with the Goldwater Institute and with the American Federation for Children, which might sound familiar to some of you because that's Betsy DeVos's organization. And Paul Boyer and a lobbyist from the American Federation for Children, they were at in the governor's office today. So we know that there's going to be a lot of arm twisting, even though these bills are not something that the citizens are interested in supporting. They want public education funded in Arizona.
I think one of the things that's so striking about this is that if you go back to the first times that these policies were introduced, and as you'll learn momentarily, my co-author and podcast co-host Jack is an education historian, so that's turned out to be very helpful. So when education savings accounts were proposed in the Reagan administration, and they landed with a thud, because at that point people really responded to the idea that any attempt to weaken public education was a terrible idea. And so even though that policy had been, they had tried to paint it as, it's very specifically about low income kids and making their funding portable so that they could vote with their feet the way that wealthy parents do. So that landed with a thud, and really, kind of was didn't go anywhere for many decades. And now education savings accounts have been reborn as, what DeVos would paint as a disruptive innovation. Right. So it's kind of amazing. And one of the things that we do in the book is we chronicle this history. Where did the idea come from? When did we first hear about it? And then how has it evolved over the years? And one thing that you're really seeing in states right now, especially in states where Republicans made gains in 2020, is that they're not so worried about portraying this kind of legislation as being in the interest of the neediest kids, right? The way that it evolved in Arizona was that the school choice advocates would identify one group of students after another, starting with, maybe kids with special needs, and then foster kids, kids with a parent in the military, kids on tribal lands, etc. Well, now what you're seeing is that states are unveiling these really sweeping proposals, like in New Hampshire, which is just over the border from me, where they're basically just starting where Arizona is headed, which is to say, you know what, we're just going to do this universally. We're going to give the money to the parent on a debit card and let them spend it on whatever they want. It might be for private school tuition. It might be a down payment on tuition, right? Because it's hard to find private school that charges $4,600 a year, which is the state funding in New Hampshire. Or the money can go to a whole range of education options, right? It could be anything. It could be homeschooling curriculum. It could be university courses. And the idea is that there's no accountability by design. And then, what you're seeing happen is that once people get wind of the far-reaching implications of this, and now that it's not, the legislation isn't being painted as, helping needy kids, you're seeing real backlash. And so I think that's very interesting that, like Arizona has sort of run out of it's originally it was about helping sort of students in need. And even now, what seems like such a blatantly transparent attempt by the author of the bill. I mean, I'm not in Arizona. I'm not really familiar with your legislative process, but I could read the bill and see instantly, like, here's how this is going to benefit parents who either already send their kids to private school or have designs on doing that. And then, like so much Arizona legislation, the roadmap for fraud is right there for you to follow, right? Like reducing the amount of time that kids have to spend in the public schools, right? It's as though they're waving a flag and saying, here's the exit, here's the nudge we're going to give you out of the exit. And then I think what really remains to be seen in Arizona is that the public smoke, right? There's 65% of people registered their strong disapproval against universal voucher expansion. So what does it say that the people who've been elected to represent them are so cavalierly disregarding that and seemingly have no concern that this will be held against him, right? Your governor wants this to be his legacy. So yes, so clearly this is not just about schools, this is also about democracy.
And I think that's one of the things that's been so frustrating to me as I've learned about this. And one of the things I loved and learned so much from your book, A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, is just how this picking away at public education, it really is a dismantling of a public system, of a public good. And it's not just happening. This is by design. And you guys do a good job explaining the kind of deceptive ways that this takes shape in different states. And Save Our Schools has gotten calls from Iowa, Kansas, North Carolina, Wisconsin, all these other states that are seeing these bills and they're like, wow, what's happening? Can you help us understand this? And so it is really frustrating because we know that the people in Arizona want good, strong public schools. We know we're 49th in per pupil spending. We have the highest teacher turnover in the nation, the lowest teacher pay still, or bottom of the barrel, even though we got by 2020, almost 20% raises for our teachers. Not everybody got that, but our teachers did get some increase in salary, but it's barely enough to make a living. And so when we see this disconnect between the people we've elected to represent us and what they're doing in ways that are going to hurt their communities and hurt their constituents, it's really, really frustrating. And then to know that these billionaires, DeVos's American Federation for Children, the Americans for Prosperity, have had a lobbyist on the ground in Arizona for a very long time. The Koch Institute, the Koch brothers, have a new education lobby called Yes, Every Kid. They are located in Arizona. They have lobbyists in Arizona. They don't in every state, but they do in Arizona. And they are pushing some of these bills. I just noticed someone in the chat mentioned one of the bills would allow credit to be given, academic credit for extracurricular activities, some of which have nothing to do with academics. And so again, it's just, it seems small and you think, oh, well, maybe that might be okay. But when you look at it in this whole picture, it's just chipping away at our public education and our community-based schools that do so much more than just educate our kids. They employ people, they provide playgrounds and all kinds of stuff to the community. So tell us a little bit more about these kind of deceptive ways, or what you guys have learned about how this works.
Well, so a lot of the inspiration for the book came not from Arizona, but from another of my favorite states, and that would be Michigan. And so I started traveling around there and found, a very similar story, right? That all these policies that on their own seemed fairly innocuous, or even like I can imagine describing somebody, yeah, we're going to give kids credit for extracurricular activities, right? That people might light up at that. They think, well, that makes a certain amount of sense, right? School kids learn all sorts of things outside of school. But then if you looked at the cumulative effect of all of these policies over a period of decades, it was thread by thread weakening the structures of public education, and really like everything having to do with the structure of education, the siphoning away the tax dollars that pay for it, making it harder for people to raise money for schools at the community level, forcing schools to compete with other schools, right? So Michigan has a very similar setup that Arizona has, where kids can move across district boundaries. There's all kinds of charter choice. And so the combined impact of all of this stuff has been to weaken the schools that, particularly in rural Michigan, are at the very heart of these communities. And then often the justification for these kinds of policies was clad in the language of racial resentment that we're so familiar with now, right? That like the kids in Detroit are getting more than you are. Your tax dollars are all being wasted in kids in Flint. And so then, but then the net impact of the policy is that the rural kids end up having to do with less too, right? Like they end up bearing the brunt of things like funding kids, or unregulated choice policies that encourage kids who have the most family support, right? Whose family can drive them, like 10, 20 miles to go to school, and then steadily weakening the schools and the kids that are left behind. And so a lot of what I would travel around and I would see these things. And then Jack and I have done a podcast together for 4 years now. And I would come back and I would ask him, like, this is what I'm seeing in Michigan. This policy doesn't make any sense to me. What do you know about this? And because he's an education historian, he always knew. And so that was really like, we set out to figure out together, what is driving this particular vision? What is it like when you go down that list of organizations that Sharon ran through, groups, like the Koch's new group, Yes Every Kid, or American Federation for Children, or the Goldwater Institute in Arizona, what is it that they want? What is their end game? And also like, what are sort of the pillars of their belief? And, what we found was that it was this absolute commitment to seeing education as a private good, right? Not as a public good. So if you think about the way that we do higher education in this country, when Sharon decides that it's time to send her kids to college, the burden of that is on Sharon, right? Like there may be some aid for the school, but her family decides how much they're willing to pay for it. And then, it's up to the family and the kids to deal with the debt that results from that. And that's actually very similar to the vision that we're talking about for K through 12, right? And so if you're using your voucher to pay for private school, but it doesn't cover the cost, on the one hand, you're not doing much to help the kids who can't front the rest of those costs. So what if we came up with a lucrative loan market, right? Like seeing every part of the process as an opportunity for profit making. So absolute insistence that education is a private good, limiting the tax burden on the wealthiest citizens among us, doing anything possible to weaken labor unions, right? I heard Rob Odell from the Arizona Republic today talking on a podcast about one way to really understand the legislative agenda in Arizona right now is as a grudge fest against teachers and parents for Red for Ed, right? And so you really see that happening in live time. And finally, it's not just the effort to constrain unions, it's really the effort to limit any kind of collective action, the ability of people to make demands. And that's why they find Save Our Schools so frustrating, right? That again and again, you've been able to rally parents and now business leaders to say, we don't believe in a future of Arizona without public schools.
We were really happy that the business leaders from the Greater Phoenix League came to testify on that voucher expansion, the ESA voucher expansion bill, because we've heard again and again, what we really need as a state is a really educated workforce across the board. Our businesses are saying that we don't want to we've had some people tell us they go outside of our state to bring people in because they can't find people here. So we know our tagline is strong schools, strong state, but we really believe that if we have great public schools that are doing right by our kids and our teachers, then we will have an educated workforce and be able to meet those needs. I think one of the things that you touched on is that really resonates with me is like the public schools are in so many ways the bedrock of our democracy. We had someone in the chat make a comment about that. And that's so true. And so all of this talk about turning schools over to the free market, and competition will decide and the best schools will raise to the top. And I just like, that's so problematic. That model is so problematic because it leaves us with winners and losers. And I don't want any of our kids to be losers. I want all of our kids to have access to a great education.
And one of the things that's so confounding about our present moment is that in so many other spheres, you really see this recognition that this kind of sense of free market fundamentalism went too far, right? Yeah. That you have, whether it's healthcare or, somebody like Josh Hawley from Missouri, railing against Walmart for really kind of ravaging small town America, right? This sense that something is out of whack in America, except for education, where the craziest proposals are being taken very seriously. So you'll hear people say over and over again, fund the students, not the systems. Well, when Betsy DeVos made that comment on her ABC interview with Leslie Stahl was really kind of agog, like, wait a second, the system, that you mean the buildings? Aren't the kids in the buildings? And you see that their vision is actually, it's to untether education from any kind of a place, right? We won't need the buildings because parents will be purchasing education options on an Amazon-like education marketplace. And so, the fact I point to Arizona as an example where the business community really does seem to be waking up to this, right? How do you lure businesses to your state on the one hand, and then also tell them, we're not doing public education anymore. We've decided to just give the money directly to the parents and let them determine. They're customizing the kids' education now. I heard an interview with Reed Hastings, who's the head of Netflix and is a very avid supporter of charter schools and charter school expansion. But when the host put this vision to him, like, what do you think of this idea about just giving some portion of our school funding directly to the parents? He was horrified by this idea because, what, like, do you just bank on the fact that somebody's going to customize their kids' education to learn to code, but it seems very short-sighted from a business point of view.
We have some great comments in the chat. People are talking about how some of our very own legislators have made a lot of money. So the free market model of school choice has worked very, very well for them. They've made millions and millions of dollars off of sometimes legislation that they made. There's a great New York Times article about DeVos and vouchers in Arizona, if anybody is interested in that. And other people are saying free market is the worst model, and mentions what just happened in Texas with the deregulated energy infrastructure there. Couple nice shout outs to good experiences people have had with public education in the chat. So that's awesome. We appreciate those comments too.
That Texas example is really great. That's exactly what I'm thinking about, right? Where you have this kind of national awakening of people saying, this is insane, right? That how could you not treat energy as a public good? And yet at the same time, you have these very aggressive, very ambitious efforts to basically dismantle public education and put into effect all the same kinds of crazy, the lack of accountability by design, the idea that people will basically, bid for education according to how much money they have. It's just it's a crazy thing and a real disconnect.
So I'm hoping Jack's going to join us in a couple minutes. Let's, what do we want to talk to him about?
Well, one thing that I think we should do, oh, he's here.
Oh, there he is.
There he is.
That was good timing.
We were just talking about you. Well, unmute yourself.
Welcome.
Hello. I hope you were saying nice things.
Well,
No,
actually,
Jennifer was talking. I get it. I know what she was doing. Great.
So we've been talking a lot about Arizona because things have been very busy there.
Mm.
But Sharon was just saying, what do you think Jack's going to want to talk about when he gets here?
The book. How about our book?
Yeah. I mean, I was wondering so we've touched sort of on pieces of it, but will you kind of just give us like an overview, sort of people who haven't read the book, what to kind of expect from it?
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's a barrel of laughs. It opens with some knock jokes and it gets into more elaborate comedy as you go through. And the end is a sort of abstract humor piece that really stretches the imagination. The first third of the book, in all seriousness, attempts to lay out the tenets of faith that are really at the heart of the effort to unmake public education. If you look only at the policies, and that's the middle third of the book, then you might get the impression that this is a completely disorganized, somewhat nonsensical, scattershot attack on public education. You might be inclined to take it less seriously, and you would certainly understand it less well. So, for instance, yes, right. Antacid tabs are a good go with for this book. I think they're frequently bought together on Amazon. If you look only at the fact that, people are supporting virtual schools and then also supporting vouchers and then also making attacks on teachers, like, well, what is holding all of this together? And that's what we try to explain in the first third of the book, where we lay out the ideology here and the core components of it, which, just to foreshadow, are really about elevating the individual over the collective or the public, just valorizing markets and devaluing democratic politics, really having skepticism at best and outright hatred for teachers' unions. And then really being obsessed with cost cutting. And so these things are sort of mutually reinforcing components of belief there. And so that's the first third of the book. I said the middle third of the book is policy. And so that I'm not monopolizing our description of the book, maybe I'll turn it over to Jennifer to talk about the last third.
So we always joke that the last third is sort of the Black Mirror section. And it's kind of like, what would it look like if we really did restructure our public education system completely along free market lines? What would it look like if every parent was a consumer who purchased education options? And what we couldn't have foreseen, we didn't know as we were writing it that there was going to be a pandemic. And we couldn't really have foreseen just how quickly the vision would become a reality in a lot of states. And so Florida is another state that, along with Arizona, is using the pandemic as an opportunity to shift huge numbers of kids onto these education savings accounts. So there's a bill that's making its way through their legislature now that would move 8% of the kids in the state onto education savings accounts, which is 250,000 kids, right? And so their parents will be purchasing education options. And the part of the vision that really just hit home for me in the bleakest possible way, they already have the beginnings of an education marketplace in Florida. So you can go and look and see what are some of the things parents are being sold, right? And so this might be, a program to teach your child to read. It could be special education services, because that's who these programs are pitched to. And then because there's no longer any democratic oversight, and because the legal protections that are embedded in the public education system have been removed as a function of these new programs, the only way that a parent can express their discontent is to either go to another school, or if it's with an education product, to call their customer service representative. And I thought, what just bleak and utterly desiccated vision of what education is, right? That it's this entirely private experience, as Jack was describing, but then it's also really like it opens up all these avenues for people to sell things to you, right? And the experience in Arizona and Florida has not been a positive one, as far as how parents who are on the receiving end of the sales pitch, how they do, right? The edupreneurs, as we call them, do very well, as Sharon was mentioning them, some of them who serve in your legislature now.
So we're getting lots of comments in the comment section. So one reader says that the chapter on advertising for charters made him think about that you can pay me now or pay me later. And so how much more expensive is incarceration, right? Arizona is near the top per capita versus education, not to mention the downside of having a reputation for a highly educated workforce. Right. So that's something the school to prison pipeline also factors into this. But and somebody else brought up a question about micro schools. And I think one of the things that I've learned about, and in part from your book and other things that I've read, is just how much school choice really is about the school's choice or the parent's ability to make a choice. Because not all parents have the ability to make that choice. Can you drive across town to take your kid to a charter school? Can you enroll your kid in a micro school? So this is one of the newest privatization things happening on the ground in Arizona. It's a company called Prenda. They've created micro schools. One of the ways micro schools are funded is with our tax dollars. And yet we don't really know how the kids do in these schools. The model, maybe it would work for some kids, and that's great. It's like you get together with your neighborhood kids and you kind of have a school, but that's a completely different way, unaccountable way of going about it. And then there's questions about, well, are these kids safe who are in those micro schools? And it's crazy. So Save Our Schools has a presentation on micro schools for anybody who's interested in that. But so often having the ability to make a choice means that you come from a family, largely more affluent, largely white. And that's what studies show, that school choice, in fact, leads to segregation. It's yet another way to have white flight in our schools systems. And it really, again, it leaves our community district neighborhood schools deeply struggling. So this all started in Arizona with open enrollment. And open enrollment sounds like, oh, well, I could decide to go to any school in my district. And that's great. Like, all right, but what happens, like just that seemingly small shift in the model means that rather than all the parents getting together and saying, what do you mean you're allowing this to happen in our school? We need to fix this. The people who can leave.
Yeah. I just want to make a comment about that, and maybe Jennifer does as well, that this is intentional It's an effort to get us to think of ourselves as consumers rather than citizens, right? Consumers don't exercise voice. Consumers exercise exit as an option, right? You don't call Kellogg's when you're unhappy with your cereal. You just by post instead. Um, and this shift is a part of a larger effort to get us to think of ourselves as individuals rather than to think of ourselves as members of collectives or communities. And if we look at, one of the most nefarious problems in public education, one of the most longstanding problems, and that would be racial segregation. And of course, economic segregation goes hand in hand with it. We can see that that's not something that's going to be solved by the market. In fact, that's where one of the areas where markets fail, right? And anybody who has ever done any serious work in economics knows that markets fail on some things. Markets are not a panacea because there are certain values that the market cannot raise up. And those are the places where we want to be particularly attentive in public education anytime there's an effort to marketize or privatize schools, right? These values oftentimes coincide with the values held by a democratic society. If those are what the market is failing on, then probably the market is not a solution to whatever the problems of public education are. In fact, probably the solution is to double down on the democratic components of public education to make it more democratic, more inclusive, even more fully funded by public tax dollars such that all schools have what they need. I just wanted to bounce all the way back to that other comment that was about the school to prison pipeline and say that one of the framings that I find most troubling in the discussion about dismantling public education is the framing around the sort of cost benefit there. And I don't think that's what this comment at all was trying to do. But I want to just underscore that when opponents of public education talk about their vision, they often talk about return on investment and will say, we want to invest in public education just enough such that students get what they need to not end up in prison because that's expensive, to not end up on the dole because that's expensive, and to become taxpayers because that's the opposite of expensive, right? That brings in revenue. And that conception of students, of young people, not as human beings with futures, but as costs, I think is a very dangerous conception. And again, I don't think that comment was even remotely in that spirit, but it made me think of the spirit that similar comments are made in. And so if we really are serious about breaking the school to prison pipeline, for instance, then we are thinking about students in a really holistic way, in a really humanistic way, and thinking about what's good for them, what do they want? Because those are the questions that lead to humane treatment of young people, that actually motivates them and gets them engaged rather than forms of compulsion or punishment. I've run on too long. I'm sure Jennifer had things to say and fell asleep 3 times while I was talking.
Well, I was thinking when Sharon was talking about micro schools, we didn't know about micro schools when we were writing the book. And I find that so frustrating. I can just feel that chapter writing itself, because it's such a perfect example of everything we're talking about, that it accomplishes every one of these goals, right? That you move kids out of the structures and systems of public education. And instead, it's like the equivalent of Uber, right? That somebody operates a schoolhouse out of their home or another facility in a way that a driver uses his car as his her workplace in an Uber world. And if you look at the advertising that Prenda does, and Prenda is the company behind these micro schools, they're quite open about the limited amount of money that a micro school teacher would make, right? That they're paid by the head and it tops out at $26,000 a year, no benefits, right? And so if you're motivated, if your core principle is cutting costs on education because you dream of the wealthiest having to pay lower taxes, this is a vision for you, right? No more facilities costs, no more teachers unions, no more school boards, nothing, right? It's just, and then the actual education is kids, basically, it's just kids online, right? So it's such a, it's so grim. And then I just wanted to pivot from that to what you guys were talking about, and sort of Jack talking in terms of exit. The book I'm recommending to absolutely everyone right now is Heather McGee's new book, The Sum of Us. And she uses this very striking metaphor of these public pools that were built by the hundreds and thousands across the US in the 20s and 30s. And yet, once desegregation orders started to be handed down, many communities destroyed their pools, drained them, filled them in order to avoid having to share them. And she argues that what she calls zero sum thinking, that pits us against one another, like that my child's advantage can only come at your child's expense. And you really see how choice just plays into this, and the combination of scarcity thinking and all of the kind of these worst tendencies. And so I'd encourage people to read that book, but also to start, like, we need a better way to talk about this stuff. That, like, we've gone on now for 45 minutes about the market discourse is a bankrupt discourse, but it's so hard for us to find another language that really resonates. So I leave that task to you, Save Our Schools, and particularly to your fine communications coordinator.
But I want to get one more word in on that point, Jennifer. Since you're recommending books, let's recommend our friend Derek Black's book, because I think that actually does a nice job of laying the groundwork for the kind of conversation that you're suggesting we should all be having, Jennifer, which is about what is public about public education. Why are we funding it with our tax dollars? Why does my neighbor down the street who doesn't have any children help pay for the school that my daughter attends? And the answer that Derek gives us, the historical answer, is related to what I was droning on about a minute ago about market failures, right? There are things that are so critical to the survival of our democracy and for the thriving of our people that we don't want to leave those to chance, that we need a population that is not only informed, but that is also broadly tolerant, that knows how to work together. We need people who, have had a kind of education in what it means to be an engaged citizen, even if you lack the paperwork to be an official citizen, right? You are a member of our civil society, and that there's a place that you can learn that. And we've created that place. It's called a school. And it's a gift that we give to young people in this nation, again, regardless of their paperwork. And that's how we ought to be talking about it. That's why I want my tax dollars going to schools, regardless of, how long I've got a kid in the schools, because I want young people in my community to have experienced those things and to be bringing those benefits to, me and my neighborhood, in my state, and in the nation.
I'm glad you brought up Derek's book, Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. It's also fabulously interesting. And like your guys's, it fills in the sort of background of the story about how this dismantling of public education has really happened so quickly. We heard a lot about innovation and school choice, and suddenly now we see how much this is damaging our public education system across the United States. Say a little more about how did that happen so fast? I mean, really, it's just been the last couple of decades. And of course, Arizona has led the way, sadly, in so much of this. But really, in the grand scheme of things, it's happened quickly.
Jack, I think you should start with this from your deep historical perspective. I went on and on letting people know that an education historian would be joining us. And so if they had any questions about how we got to where we are, that you were their guy.
I see. Okay, happy to do that, Jennifer. So there are two answers to this. I'm going to give you a real Jack Schneider response. There are two answers to this. One answer is that it has happened very quickly, but the answer I'm going to start with is that it hasn't been quick at all. That it begins in the wake of Barry Goldwater's defeat to Lyndon Johnson, and that a core of young conservatives who had been turned on to the kind of libertarian conservatism that he was peddling, began building institutions. And we don't see that pay off for many decades, but it took decades of work to build organizations like Cato and American Enterprise and the Heartland Institute at the state level, the Mackinac Institute, the Goldwater Institute, right? That they set about building an infrastructure for realizing their aims of unmaking these aspects of public life that they found intolerable. That they ultimately were responsible for the election of Ronald Reagan, right? It wasn't Reagan who created this movement. It was the movement that created Reagan. And that was their sort of first coming out party. But in terms of public education, they had not sufficiently laid the groundwork there, because Reagan, of course, pushed for vouchers and lost on it and tucked his tail and didn't want anything to do with public education until A Nation at Risk, that 1983 report, was accidentally a success. So what we then see is that the story of their success is that their unwitting Democratic counterparts laid a long runway for them to land their policy airplane on. That's the metaphor I've been using lately, because there was this neoliberal consensus. We see it run from George H.W. Bush through Bill Clinton, through George W. Bush and Barack Obama, a consensus around treating schools like businesses and managing them in a corporate style via testing and accountability, and then exposing them to market-like forces through controlled choice via public schools, but charter schools. This kind of neoliberal logic led to all kinds of openings for this present movement. So, Betsy DeVos should not have been a surprise to us, because for true believers like DeVos and her allies, something like charters, for instance, that was never the end game. It was the end game for charter believers like Cory Booker, who, were photographed on stage with Betsy DeVos. And they believed that that was the end goal. But of course, for somebody like DeVos, that was a means to an end, right? Their unwitting allies were just, further creating opportunities to expand these programs, to push them to their further limits. And of course, that's one of the things that we try to do in the book, is show you exactly what those limits are. What is the real end game there?
That was a very satisfying answer, Jack. I feel like we're just the more we're here, I just want to recommend book after book. So somebody mentioned Nancy McLean's book.
You should recommend some of my books then. You never recommend my books,
No,
Jennifer.
Didn't I recommend your book at the beginning?
Oh.
I think I referred to A Better Measure.
She did.
So somebody put Nancy McLean's book in the chat, Democracy in Chains. And then I was thinking just now of another book called Invisible Hands, by Kim Phillips Fine. And it's about sort of just how mad conservative business people have been in this country for so long, that they basically got pissed off around the New Deal, and that they've spent, all this time trying to claw back the power that they thought the government took away from them and handed to workers. And one of the things that this is really the story of the Kochs. And one of the things that really infuriates them now, as basically back till the 30s and 40s, is that they saw our schools didn't do a good enough job of preparing kids to be ardent free marketeers. And so you'll see this as this is a constant source of frustration, and frankly, like a justification for getting kids out of the public schools. And then during the Reagan era, you start to see the free market folks joining forces with the rising religious right, who see the schools as a place of godlessness. And that, that overlap really, that never leaves us. And so we fast forward to today, and I saw somebody put up in the chat that we hear K-12 schools now discussed as like really, they're just places where it's all liberalism, right? And we've seen this happen with higher ed, that more and more conservative lawmakers complain that college is where kids go to be indoctrinated, so we shouldn't pay for it. And we should fire those professors like Jack. And now you see that same kind of rhetoric being used around K-12, and that is especially the case in Arizona. I point, my friends who live in blue bubbles, I tell them, pay attention to what's happening in Arizona around issues like sex ed and anything having to do with diversity and inclusion. This is becoming dangerously politicized in a way that's going to be hard for our public schools to survive.
So I've put a couple of links in the chat. So we mentioned early on that Jennifer and Jack have a podcast called Have You Heard? And there are many episodes, really, really informative and interesting. These two are so smart and so good at helping us understand how complicated and important this issue is around public education. I also put a link into Save Our Schools Arizona Network has a blog. We have all kinds of resources. One of the main things that we do is just talk to people, because we know people support public schools, but they often don't know how to have a voice to make sure that their neighbors, their teachers, their elected officials know that they support public schools. So we hope you'll visit our website, sosaznetwork.org. And then one of our most popular blogs is called The Racist Roots of Private School Vouchers. So I put the link for that in there. And really the history, I think, of all of this, Jack, like you were saying, does go back, especially specific to vouchers, goes back to Milton Friedman a year after the passing of Board versus Brown of Education. And so the roots of vouchers have always been deeply segregationist and remain so in Arizona, in spite of how they try to tell us otherwise. So we have maybe just another minute or two for another question. I think we've maybe touched on everything. If I've missed anybody in the chat, I'm sorry. See if anything, and do you guys want to just some closing words on how we can all be in this fight together and stay positive in spite of the fact that things are kind of dire right now and our public education system needs our help?
Yeah, the thing I was going to jump in and say in response to you saying, that one of your missions is to just talk to people, is that is so powerful, because the rhetoric in public education and the narratives about public schools are so dangerous, but also so shallow, right? These are very thin bubbles that are easy to puncture with some pretty straightforward questions. Just in terms of the kinds of things that I like to talk with people about, I like to ask them how they know how America's 98,000 public schools where their kids don't go to school, how they know how those schools are doing. Tell me, what's your source of information? I'm so fascinated. I'd love to know how you made time to go to all of them. Right? That once we begin to actually identify what we know and what we don't know, what's rhetoric and what's reality, I think what we can come back to is actually there are some things we do know, and a lot of that seems really positive. Jennifer and I were talking with another group, and I ended up going on too long, as I often do, about a mentor of mine from graduate school who said, well, we need is a conservation ethic in public education, because the narrative of reform often ends up leading to opportunities to be disruptive in education and to undermine a lot of the good work that isn't valorized in the same way that reform, which is constantly being fetishized, is valorized. And the conservation ethic, not conservatism, but the conservation ethic that guides us, in the protection of natural spaces, right? That there's a lot that we would change about our schools. And let's talk honestly and openly about it. But there's a lot that we want to protect. especially the values that guide our system, and as those values have evolved over the decades, and our schools have become more fair, more inclusive, as they have done a better job at creating opportunity for young people, as they've become more fully funded. There are a lot of things to be incredibly proud of, that we should fiercely fight for and protect, and that we can tell stories about and talk honestly and openly about, while also acknowledging some of the flaws that we want to address.
I know your goal, Jack, was to go right up to the 7 o'clock mark so that I wouldn't be
I
able to
left you
get
a minute. I left you a whole
my last
minute.
word in. One of the things that I so admire about Save Our Schools is that your membership includes people of divergent political views, and that is so hard to come by right now. One of, really the only hope we have, not just as far as protecting public education, but and restitching the bitter divide in our country, is to build alliances between urban parents and rural parents. And like that's, I feel like the conversation around public education, no matter how politicized it might seem right now, is one of the few areas that really has the possibility to do that. And I feel, more encouraged as Jack and I have the opportunity to go around and be in Zoom boxes with people who disagree on all kinds of things, but are not ready to just sort of junk the institution of public education.
So I think we have run out of time. I just want to say how grateful I am to both of you for the amazing book, A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door. So I know a lot of people, just based on the chat, have read it, but I know there are others who will be excited to read it. I'm really appreciative to Changing Hands, to making this event happen. And I hope all of you listening will visit us at Save Our Schools Arizona network on our website. You can email me at sharon@sosaznetwork.org. We're always available to help people better understand what's going on in our state with public education and how to get involved. So thank you all very much.
And thank you so much, everyone. If you missed my spiel at the beginning, if you opted for a curbside pickup for your books, we have them at both Phoenix and Tempe. If you're getting your books mailed to you, unfortunately, last week's cold snap delayed our shipment, so we're still waiting for the books. But once we get them in, we'll ship them out as soon as possible. Again, thank you so much to Jennifer and Jack and Sharon, and especially Save Our Schools, just for inviting us to co-sponsor this event. We hope that everyone stays safe and healthy, and we hope to see you again real soon. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.